Welcome to your stone-cold hell. The year is 1346. Your eyes flutter open to darkness so complete. You're not entirely sure you haven't died and gone to some particularly unimaginative purgatory. But no, the assault on your nostrils confirms. You're still very much alive, trapped in what poets call a noble stronghold, and what any reasonable person would call a monument to human suffering built from rocks.o. And before we dive into this delightful tour of medieval misery, leave a comment below telling me what country you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious to know exactly when and where in the world people are choosing to hear about chamber pots and plague rats instead of sleeping. It's probably more entertaining than whatever's on Netflix anyway. Welcome to your new life, dear viewer. You've woken up in a medieval castle, and I'm afraid the fairy tales lied to you about literally everything. You're not bell-gazing wistfully from a tower window. You're more like the human equivalent of a medieval iPhone, expensive to maintain, constantly breaking down, and surrounded by people who have no idea how you actually work. The first thing that hits you isn't the grandeur or the majesty, it's the smell. According to historical records from English heritage, medieval castles were assault courses for your nostrils, filled with what one contemporary described as the mingled perfumes of unwashed bodies, rotting rushes, and the ever-present miasma of the privy. That's a 14th century way of saying your new home smells like a combination of a gym locker, a garbage disposal, and that one gas station bathroom you promised yourself you'd never think about again. But let's be more specific about this olfactory nightmare, shall we? The rushes on the floor. Those plant materials that medieval people scattered around like the world's worst air freshener weren't changed nearly often enough. According to research from the University of Reading, these rushes accumulated food scraps, animal droppings, spilled ale, vomit from drunken guests, and whatever else medieval feet happened to drag in from the outside world. Imagine a carpet made of compost that's been fermenting for months, sprinkled with the occasional dead mouse, and you're starting to get the picture. The walls themselves contribute to the aromatic assault. Stone is porous, and after decades of absorbing smoke from torches, cooking fires, and human habitation, medieval castle walls had essentially become giant stone sponges soaked in centuries of accumulated funk. Add to this the fact that lime, mortar, the stuff holding the stones together, has a delightful tendency to absorb and then slowly release moisture, along with whatever odors happen to be floating around. And you've got walls that are basically medieval scratch and sniff stickers, except every scent is ode to medieval despair. You're lying on what passes for a bed in this architectural nightmare, a straw mattress so thin you can feel every stone in the floor beneath you, covered by rough woolen blankets that feel like they were woven from the fur of particularly irritated wolves. The mattress itself is a festival of biological warfare. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and if you're truly blessed by medieval fortune, a few enterprising rats who've decided your sleeping arrangements are more comfortable than theirs. But here's the thing about medieval beds that really drives home the misery they were shared. Not just between spouses, but between entire families, guests, servants, and whatever parasites decided to join the party. Medieval hospitality demanded that travelers be given accommodation, which often meant squeezing additional bodies into already overcrowded sleeping arrangements. Historical records from Goodrich Castle showed that guests were routinely expected to share beds with complete strangers, their servants, and whatever vermin had taken up residence in the bedding. The mattresses themselves were stuffed with straw, that was changed perhaps once a year if you were lucky, twice a year if you were nobility, and never if you were a servant. This straw became a thriving ecosystem over time, hosting not just insects, but also mold, mildew, and occasionally small rodents who appreciated the free housing. The woolen blankets, meanwhile, were woven so roughly that they could double as medieval sandpaper, and they retained moisture with the efficiency of a sponge, ensuring that you were always either cold and damp or cold and scratchy. The temperature in your chamber hovers somewhere between meat locker and polar expedition. Gone wrong. Stone walls, which looked so romantically solid in all those movies, are actually magnificent conductors of cold, sucking every molecule of warmth from the air with the efficiency of a medieval vampire. The physics are simple and brutal. Stone has an enormous thermal mass, which means it absorbs heat during the day and then radiates that cold back at you all night long, creating a natural refrigeration system that would make modern engineers weep with envy if they were trying to preserve food, and weep with despair if they were trying to keep humans comfortable. The windows, if you can call them that, are narrow slits, designed more for shooting arrows at people than for letting in light or keeping out the elements. These arrow loops, or murder holes as they were cheerfully called, were specifically designed to be as small as possible while still allowing defenders to fire projectiles at attackers. This meant that your primary source of natural light was also your primary source of drafts, creating a constant stream of cold air that turned your living space into a medieval wind tunnel. Glass was a luxury, so rare and expensive that most castle windows were simply holes in the wall, covered by wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or, if you were truly unfortunate, nothing at all. The few castles that could afford glass windows used thick, uneven panes that distorted everything and provided about as much clarity as looking through a bottle of medieval ale. These windows were also incredibly fragile. A well-placed stone from a siege engine could shatter your entire window budget for the year. The shutters themselves created their own problems. Close them to keep out the cold, and you're plunged into darkness so complete that you need torches or candles to see your own hands. Leave them open for light, and you might as well be sleeping outdoors in the middle of winter. It was a daily choice between hypothermia and living like a mole, and neither option was particularly appealing. As you sit up, your body protests every movement. Medieval beds weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to keep you slightly more elevated than the rats, and that was considered a triumph of engineering. Your spine feels like it's been used as a practice target for trebuchets, which, given the quality of medieval furniture, isn't entirely impossible. The wooden bed frame, if you're fortunate enough to have one, was constructed from whatever timber was available locally, usually without any consideration for ergonomics, comfort, or basic human anatomy. The room around you stretches upward into shadows that seem to mock the very concept of privacy. These walls have witnessed everything: births, deaths, political betrayals, countless attempts at medieval dentistry that would make modern waterboarding look like a spa treatment, and probably more than a few instances of people dying from what we'd now recognize as completely preventable illnesses. The ceiling disappears into darkness above, and somewhere in that void, you can hear the scurrying of creatures that have made your home their personal highway system. The acoustics in medieval castles were designed by people who apparently never heard of the concept of sound dampening. Every whisper echoes, every footstep reverberates, and every sneeze becomes a public announcement broadcast throughout the entire structure. The stone walls and floors create a natural amplification system that turns normal human activities into a constant cacophony, according to historical accounts from castles like Warwick and Edinburgh. The sound of daily life, servants working, animals moving around, people talking, children crying, created a constant background noise that made sleep difficult and privacy impossible. Speaking of privacy, forget it. The concept simply didn't exist in medieval castle life. According to historical documentation from Goodrich Castle, Countess Joan de Valence had nearly 100 servants crammed into what researchers describe as quite a small castle. Imagine trying to find a moment's peace when you're sharing your living space with enough people to populate a modern office building, none of whom have discovered deodorant yet. But it gets worse. Medieval castles operated on what we might call the communal living principle, except instead of being a voluntary lifestyle choice, it was a brutal necessity dictated by architecture, economics, and security concerns. Servants slept in halls, kitchens, stables, and wherever else they could find floor space. Noble families often shared chambers with their most trusted servants, who slept on pallets on the floor or in adjoining alcoves. Privacy was so rare that medieval etiquette books spent considerable time instructing people on how to pretend they hadn't seen or heard things that were clearly visible and audible to everyone in the room. The seasonal variations in castle life deserve special mention, because they transform your stone prison from merely uncomfortable to actively hostile depending on the time of year. Winter in a medieval castle was like being trapped inside a giant ice cube that occasionally tried to kill you with falling icicles. The thick stone walls that provided excellent defense against human enemies provided no defense whatsoever against the laws of thermodynamics. Heat from the few fireplaces would rise straight up to the ceiling and then dissipate into the atmosphere, leaving the actual living spaces at temperatures that would make a modern refrigerator feel tropical. Summer brought its own special miseries. Those same stone walls that turned your home into a freezer during winter became solar collectors during the hot months, absorbing heat all day and then radiating it back at you all night. The narrow windows that failed to keep out winter drafts also failed to provide adequate ventilation, turning your castle into a stone oven filled with the accumulated smells of dozens or hundreds of people living in close quarters without effective sanitation. The ventilation system in medieval castles consisted primarily of hope for the best. Smoke from cooking fires, torches, and fireplaces was supposed to exit through holes in the roof or early chimney systems. But more often than not, it simply accumulated in the upper reaches of rooms before slowly settling back down over everything, like a medieval fog machine operated by someone with a personal vendetta against clean air. This constant exposure to smoke created respiratory problems that were so common they were considered normal parts of life. Your stomach growls, and you realize it's time to face one of the great adventures of castle life: breakfast. But first, you need to navigate the morning routine, which begins with the delightful medieval tradition of emptying your chamber pot. Yes, that ceramic bowl beside your bed isn't decorative. It's your personal toilet, and unless you want to venture through the freezing corridors to find the communal garderobe medieval toilet, you've been sharing your sleeping space with your own waste all night. The chamber pot system was actually considered a luxury upgrade from the alternative, which was either using the garderobe or simply relieving yourself wherever seemed convenient. Medieval people had a much more casual relationship with human waste than we do today, partly out of necessity and partly because they didn't understand the connection between sanitation and disease. Chamber pots were emptied by servants who carried them through the living areas of the castle to disposal sites, creating aromatic processions that announce themselves well in advance. The garderobe, when you do encounter it, is a marvel of medieval engineering in the same way that a catapult is a marvel of medieval transportation. Technically functional, but you wouldn't want to rely on it in a crisis. These were simple holes cut into stone seats, positioned over shafts that dropped waste either into the moat below or onto unfortunate hillsides. The engineering principle was elegant in its simplicity. Gravity plus distance equals someone else's problem. But the practical reality of garderobe use was considerably less elegant. The seats were carved from cold stone, making winter visits an exercise in shock therapy. The holes were often large enough that users faced a genuine risk of falling through, especially children or anyone suffering from medieval malnutrition. The smell was so overwhelming that garderobes were positioned as far as possible from the main living areas, which meant a pre-dawn trek through freezing corridors. If nature called at an inconvenient hour, the waste disposal system also created its own set of problems. Garderobes that emptied into moats turned those defensive water features into open sewers, creating breeding grounds for disease and ensuring that any siege involving contamination of water supplies was essentially redundant. Garderobes that emptied onto hillsides created permanent waste deposits that attracted vermin, contaminated groundwater, and generally turned the immediate vicinity of the castle into a biological hazard zone. As you stumble toward what passes for breakfast, the stone floors beneath your feet seem designed by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the concept of comfort. Every step sends shockwaves through your bones, and the sensation of walking on stone all day, every day, created foot problems that were so common they were accepted as normal parts of aging. Medieval people developed calluses, joint problems, and foot deformities that modern podiatrists would classify as occupational injuries, except the occupation was simply existing in a medieval castle. The rushes scattered across the floor, the medieval equivalent of carpeting, have become a biological experiment in decomposition. These plant materials were supposed to provide insulation and absorb spills, but they mostly served as a breeding ground for insects and a repository for food scraps, animal droppings, and whatever else medieval feet happened to drag in from the outside world. The rushes were changed irregularly, often only when they became so putrid that even medieval noses, which were accustomed to a constant background of unpleasant odors, found them intolerable. The corridors you navigate are architectural triumphs of impracticality. They're wide enough for armed men to move through quickly during an emergency, but this also means they're impossible to heat effectively and create wind tunnels that channel cold air throughout the castle. The height of the ceilings, designed to accommodate banners and create an impressive visual impact, ensures that any heat generated at ground level immediately rises out of the range, where it might actually benefit human beings. These corridors also serve as highways for the castle's extensive rodent population. Medieval castles were essentially giant stone apartment buildings for rats, mice, and various other creatures that found the combination of food scraps, warm hiding places, and minimal pest control to be an ideal living situation. The thick walls provided perfect nesting sites, and the abundance of stored grain and food waste created a buffet that supported thriving rodent communities. You pass other inhabitants beginning their day, and the hierarchy becomes immediately apparent through the brutal efficiency of medieval social stratification. If you're noble, you're surrounded by servants whose primary job is to ensure you don't die of exposure, starvation, or your own incompetence, at least not before you can produce an heir or fulfill whatever political obligations brought you. to this stone monument to human endurance in the first place. If you're a servant, you're about to begin a 14-hour workday that would make modern labor laws spontaneously combust. According to records from English heritage, servants began work at 5:30 a.m. in summer and worked until about 7 p.m., with few days off and little pay, though they were given uniforms in their lord's colors and regular meals, which was considered a significant perk in an economy where most people spent their entire lives on the edge of starvation. The servant hierarchy itself was a complex system of suffering with different levels of misery depending on your specific role. At the top were positions like steward, chamberlain, and marshal servants who had achieved enough status to have their own servants, which was like being the manager of a medieval customer service department. These higher-ranking servants often had their own chambers, better food, and the privilege of being closer to the warmth and light of the main fires. In the middle were specialized servants like cooks, grooms, and craftsmen who had valuable skills that made them slightly less replaceable than the general labor force. They usually slept in designated areas related to their work: cooks near the kitchens, grooms in the stables, craftsmen in workshops, which meant they were at least guaranteed sleeping spaces, even if those spaces were located in the most functional rather than comfortable areas of the castle. At the bottom were the general laborers, scullery maids, turnspits, and gong farmers, who performed the most unpleasant tasks and had no guaranteed sleeping arrangements at all. These servants essentially lived like medieval zombies, stumbling through their duties on minimal sleep while surrounded by the constant sounds, smells, and general chaos of castle life. They slept wherever they could find space: in kitchens after the fires died down, in corridors during brief periods when foot traffic decreased, in storage rooms, among the supplies they were responsible for maintaining. The work itself was relentless and often dangerous. Kitchen servants faced constant risks of burns, cuts, and exposure to spoiled food. Stable hands dealt with large animals that could easily kill or maim them. Cleaning staff worked with primitive tools and harsh chemicals when chemicals were available at all to maintain sanitation standards that were basically better than a plague pit, usually. As you make your way toward the Great Hall for breakfast, you begin to understand that medieval castle life was less romantic fairy tale and more survival reality show with a medieval theme and no possibility of elimination by viewer vote. The architecture that looks so impressive from the outside becomes a daily obstacle course of discomfort, inconvenience, and assault on every sense you possess. The Great Hall itself is a monument to medieval priorities, impressive enough to intimidate visitors, large enough to accommodate the entire household for meals and gatherings, and absolutely impossible to heat effectively. The central hearth provides a small circle of warmth, surrounded by vast expanses of bone-chilling air circulation. The ceiling soars upward into darkness, creating a vertical space that ensures most of the heat generated by the fire immediately rises out of range of the people who actually need it. The smoke from the fire, instead of politely exiting through chimneys which weren't commonly used until later medieval periods, simply rises toward the ceiling and then settles back down over everything like a medieval fog machine, operated by someone with a grudge against human lungs. This constant exposure to smoke created respiratory problems that were so common among castle inhabitants that chronic coughing was considered a normal part of aging rather than a symptom of environmental poisoning. The tables and benches in the Great Hall were constructed from whatever timber was available locally, without cushions, padding, or any other concessions to human comfort. Meals were eaten while sitting on hard wooden surfaces that left permanent impressions on parts of your anatomy that were never designed to serve as contact points with medieval furniture. The tables themselves were often simply boards laid across trestles, creating unstable eating surfaces that could collapse without warning if too much weight was applied, or if the supports shifted. So here you are, standing in the great hall at what can generously be called breakfast time. Though medieval people had a much more flexible relationship with time than we do, partly because accurate timekeeping was impossible, and partly because when you're constantly on the verge of starvation, mealtime is whenever food happens to be available. The scene before you would make a modern health inspector spontaneously combust, then rise from the ashes just to die again from shock. Long wooden tables stretch across the hall, already populated by various members of the household hierarchy, each group carefully segregated according to their social status, like some dystopian cafeteria, where your seating arrangement could literally determine whether you live or die. The lord and lady sit at the high table on a raised platform, not because they're particularly important in the grand scheme of the universe, but because elevation was the medieval equivalent of a VIP section. It literally put you above everyone else and made it slightly less likely that you'd be stabbed during dinner by someone with a grievance and a sharp knife. The food arriving at these tables represents medieval cuisine in all its questionable glory, and by glory I mean triumph of human stubbornness over basic food safety principles. According to records from English heritage and various medieval household accounts, breakfast typically consisted of bread that could double as a weapon, ale that was safer to drink than water, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval water quality, and whatever meat products had survived the night without achieving total putrefaction. Let's talk about the bread first, because it's a perfect example of how medieval people took a simple concept and turned it into an endurance test that would challenge modern jaw muscles. Medieval bread was baked in massive communal ovens, often once or twice a week, depending on fuel availability and whether the baker had died recently. By the time you're eating it, this bread has achieved the consistency of compressed sawdust mixed with disappointment and aged to perfection in conditions that would make a modern food scientist weep. The crust is hard enough to use as armor plating. In fact, there are documented cases of medieval people using stale bread as makeshift weapons during tavern brawls. The interior has the texture of sand that's been mixed with regret and allowed to fossilize over several geological epochs. Medieval bakers achieved this remarkable consistency by using flour that was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and whatever else happened to be growing in the grain stores. The grain itself came from storage areas that doubled as luxury hotels for rodents, insects, and various fungi that had developed sophisticated civilizations in the castle's food supplies. Medieval granaries were essentially biological research laboratories where different species of mold competed for dominance, while rats held philosophical debates about the meaning of existence. The flour produced from this grain carried the accumulated wisdom of these microscopic civilizations, along with their bodily waste products. But here's the thing about medieval bread that really drives home the misery. It was often the primary source of calories for most people, which meant you had to eat large quantities of this geological specimen to survive. Medieval people developed jaw muscles that would make modern bodybuilders weep with envy, simply from the daily effort of consuming enough bread to avoid starvation. Archaeological evidence shows that dental wear from chewing medieval bread was so severe that historians can determine the social status of medieval skeletons by examining tooth erosion patterns, the poorer you were, the more your teeth looked like they'd been filed down by an aggressive medieval dentist with anger management issues. The bread was often enriched with additional ingredients that medieval bakers included either intentionally or through creative interpretation of food safety standards. These additions included sawdust for bulk, ground bones for calcium, though they didn't know about calcium, and whatever else happened to be lying around the bakery. During times of famine, bread might include ground acorns, tree bark, or root vegetables that had achieved states of decay that would make modern compost piles look appetizing. The process of eating medieval bread required specific techniques that were passed down through generations like sacred knowledge. You had to soak it in ale, broth, or whatever liquid was available to soften it enough that your teeth could penetrate the surface. The soaking process often took several minutes, during which the bread would absorb flavors from whatever it was soaking in, creating combinations that ranged from aggressively unpleasant to actively hostile to human taste buds. The ale served at breakfast deserves its own detailed examination because it represents medieval beverage production in all its chaotic splendor. Medieval ale wasn't the refreshing beverage you might imagine. It was thick, often sour, and contained enough sediment to qualify as a food group in its own right. The brewing process was a fascinating exercise in controlled chaos that produced results ranging from barely drinkable to mildly hallucinogenic to probably toxic, but we're drinking it anyway. Medieval ale was brewed in large batches without any understanding of sterilization, temperature control, or quality assurance. The brewing vessels were often the same containers used for other purposes: cooking, washing, storing various substances that probably shouldn't be mixed with consumable beverages. The water used for brewing came from wells that were often contaminated with runoff from garderobes, animal waste, and general medieval filth that had achieved remarkable complexity over centuries of accumulation. According to research from medieval brewing records, ale was consumed at breakfast because water was genuinely dangerous. Wells were often contaminated with substances that would make a modern water treatment plant declare bankruptcy and flee to another profession. The brewing process, even when done incorrectly by people who had learned their techniques from other people who didn't really understand what they were doing, killed enough bacteria to make ale marginally safer than water. Though this safety came at the cost of consuming alcohol with every meal, starting first thing in the morning. Medieval people lived in a constant state of mild intoxication, which probably helped them cope with the general awfulness of their daily existence. The alcohol content of medieval ale varied wildly depending on the brewing conditions, the quality of ingredients, and whether the brewer had remembered to include all the necessary steps in the process. Some batches were so weak they were essentially flavored water, while others were strong enough to be used as industrial solvents. The flavor of medieval ale was influenced by whatever ingredients were available locally and whatever had fallen into the brewing vessels during the production process. Hops weren't widely used until later in the medieval period, so ale was flavored with various herbs, spices, and whatever else medieval brewers thought might improve the taste. These additions included wormwood, bog, myrtle, heather, and combinations of plants that would make modern botanists question the sanity of medieval agriculture. Now, let's discuss the meat situation, which deserves extended attention because it represents medieval food preservation in all its horrifying glory. The persistent myth that medieval people ate spoiled meat disguised with spices has been thoroughly debunked by food historians. But the reality was actually worse. They ate meat that was preserved using techniques that would make modern food. Safety experts require intensive therapy and career counseling. Salting was the primary preservation method, and medieval people salted meat with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that if a little salt was good, then enough salt to preserve a mummy was obviously better. According to medieval cooking manuscripts and household records, meat was often salted to concentrations of 5 to 10%, creating what was essentially edible leather that required extensive soaking before it could be chewed by normal human teeth. The salt used wasn't the refined product we know today. It was crude rock salt that contained various impurities, including sand, dirt, metal particles, and whatever else happened to be in the salt mines when it was extracted by workers who weren't particularly concerned about quality control. The salting process involved packing meat in layers of salt inside wooden barrels or stone containers, where it would remain for weeks or months, depending on the size of the pieces and how long the household expected to survive on their preserved food supplies. During this time, the meat would essentially mummify, losing most of its moisture and achieving a texture that could double as construction material. Medieval preserved meat required soaking in water or ale for hours before it could be cooked, and even then it retained enough salt to make your eyes water and your kidneys. File formal complaints. Smoking was another popular preservation technique, which involved hanging meat over fires for days or weeks until it achieved the consistency and flavor of charcoal mixed with disappointment, and aged in conditions that would make a modern smokehouse operator change careers. The wood used for smoking wasn't carefully selected for flavor profiles. It was whatever happened to be available, which could include anything from fruit woods to furniture salvaged from demolished buildings to random branches that had fallen. During storms, this created smoked meat with flavor profiles that ranged from aggressively unpleasant to actively hostile to human taste buds, to probably edible if you're desperate enough. The smoking process also introduced various chemical compounds that modern food scientists would classify as interesting from a toxicology perspective, but that medieval people accepted as normal parts of food production. The meat itself came from animals that lived lives of medieval misery before achieving the blessed release of death through methods that weren't particularly concerned with minimizing suffering or maintaining meat quality. Medieval livestock was smaller, tougher, and considerably less appetizing than modern animals. Cows were primarily work animals that were only slaughtered when they became too old or sick to perform their duties, which meant the meat came from elderly, stressed animals whose flesh had the texture of rope and the flavor of resentment, mixed with whatever they'd been eating during their final months of existence. These animals spent their lives working in fields, pulling plows, carrying heavy loads, and generally building muscle mass that was optimized for endurance rather than tenderness. Medieval beef had the consistency of modern shoe leather and required extensive cooking to break down the muscle fibers enough that human teeth could make meaningful progress. The cooking process often took hours and required techniques that medieval cooks had developed through trial and error over generations of struggling with recalcitrant animal proteins. Pork was more popular because pigs could survive on garbage and food scraps, making them the ideal livestock for a civilization that produced large quantities of waste and limited quantities of proper animal feed. But this survival strategy also meant that medieval pigs were essentially four-legged waste, disposal units that converted kitchen refuse, human waste, and whatever else they could find into technically edible protein. Medieval pigs ate everything from kitchen scraps to human excrement, creating meat that was flavorful in ways that modern people would find deeply disturbing, and that carried flavor profiles reflecting their diverse dietary experiences. The slaughter and butchering process was performed by people who had learned their techniques through apprenticeships with other people who had learned their techniques through trial and error, creating a knowledge chain that was occasionally accurate but more often resembled a medieval game of telephone played with sharp knives and large animals. Butchering was often done in the same areas where other food preparation occurred, creating opportunities for cross-contamination that would make modern health inspectors require sedatives. The cooking methods available didn't help improve the situation. Most meat was either roasted over open fires or boiled in large cauldrons, with no understanding of temperature control, food safety, or basic cooking techniques that would optimize flavor and texture. Roasted meat was often burned on the outside and raw in the center, while boiled meat was cooked until it achieved the consistency of wet rope that had been soaked in whatever liquids happened to be available. Medieval cooks worked with equipment that was basic to the point of being prehistoric. Cooking fires were difficult to control, and temperature regulation was achieved through techniques that resembled medieval gambling more than modern cooking science. Meat might be simultaneously overcooked and undercooked, depending on its position relative to the fire and how much attention the cook was able to pay while managing multiple dishes and avoiding burns from primitive cooking equipment. Spices, when available, weren't used to disguise spoiled meat as popular myth suggests. They were far too expensive for that kind of casual food improvement. According to economic records from medieval trade guilds, common spices like pepper were literally worth their weight in silver, making them too valuable to waste on covering up bad meat. A pound of black pepper could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled craftsman, making it more valuable than most people's annual income. When spices were used, it was to demonstrate wealth and status, not to improve food safety. A meal heavily seasoned with expensive spices was the medieval equivalent of eating off gold plates while wearing designer clothing. It was conspicuous consumption designed to impress guests and demonstrate your financial superiority over people who were forced to eat unseasoned food like common peasants. The amount of spices used was often proportional to the importance of the occasion and the social status of the guests, creating meals that were sometimes more spice than food. The vegetables available were equally challenging from a culinary perspective. Medieval people had access to root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions, but these were often stored in conditions that would make a modern root cellar look like a sterile laboratory operated by obsessive-compulsive scientists. Vegetables were kept in underground storage areas that were also home to rodents, insects, and whatever else decided that your food supplies looked like attractive real estate with convenient dining options. These storage areas were essentially medieval apartment complexes where different species coexisted in ways that weren't always beneficial to food quality. Rats gnawed on vegetables, insects laid eggs in storage containers, and various fungi developed thriving civilizations that transformed simple root vegetables into complex biological ecosystems. By the time vegetables reached the kitchen, they often required extensive cleaning and preparation to remove the accumulated contributions of their uninvited storage companions. Medieval vegetables were also smaller, tougher, and less flavorful than modern varieties. Agricultural techniques were basic, soil management was primitive, and crop selection was based more on survival than on taste or nutritional value. Vegetables were grown in soil that was often contaminated with human and animal waste, creating growing conditions that would make modern organic farmers reconsider their career choices. The preparation of vegetables involved techniques that were designed more for survival than for culinary excellence. Vegetables were often boiled until they achieved the consistency of baby food, partly to make them easier to digest, and partly because medieval cooking equipment wasn't sophisticated enough to support more complex preparation methods. The boiling process removed most of the nutritional value and created vegetables that had the texture and flavor of disappointment. Mixed with whatever seasonings were available, fruits were seasonal luxuries that were either eaten immediately after harvest or preserved in ways that fundamentally altered their nature and often their edibility. Medieval people made fruit preserves by cooking fruit with honey or sugar when available, until the result had roughly the consistency and nutritional value of candy that had been stored in conditions that would challenge modern food preservation techniques. Fresh fruit was so rare during winter months that scurvy was a common problem, even among the wealthy who could theoretically afford better nutrition. The preservation of fruits involved techniques that were more hopeful than scientific. Fruits were dried, pickled, or cooked into preserves using methods that had been passed down through generations of people, who were more concerned with preventing starvation than with maintaining flavor or nutritional content. The results were often barely recognizable as having once been fruits, and the taste was frequently more reminiscent of the preservation materials than of the original fruit. The dining implements available were basic to the point of being prehistoric, creating eating experiences that were more like manual labor than modern dining. Most people ate with their hands, using bread as plates called trenchers that absorbed the grease and juices from the meal before being eaten themselves. This system meant that your plate was also part of your meal, and by the end of dinner, you were consuming bread that had absorbed the accumulated flavors and fluids from everything else you'd eaten. Knives were shared, utensils that doubled as weapons, creating dining situations where every meal was potentially a scene from a medieval thriller. These knives were often the same implements that were used for other purposes throughout the day: cutting rope, preparing food, defending against attackers, and whatever else required sharp metal objects. The hygiene implications of this multi-purpose approach to cutlery were significant and generally ignored by everyone involved. Forks weren't widely used until much later in the medieval period, making them exotic utensils that most people had never seen, much less used. The absence of forks meant that eating anything that couldn't be easily grasped with fingers or scooped with bread required creative problem-solving and often resulted in dining experiences that resembled contact sports more than civilized meals. Spoons existed but were expensive enough that most people owned one, if any, and shared it among family members and guests. This sharing arrangement created opportunities for disease transmission that medieval people accepted as normal parts of communal dining. The spoons themselves were often carved from wood or fashioned from metal by craftsmen who weren't particularly concerned with ergonomics or ease of use, creating utensils that were functional but not comfortable. The social dynamics of medieval meals were as complex as they were uncomfortable, creating dining experiences that combined food consumption with political theater and social enforcement. Seating arrangements were strictly hierarchical, with your position at the table corresponding directly to your social status, your relationship with the host, and your current standing in the complex web of medieval politics. The closer you sat to the lord and lady, the better your food, the more attention you received from servants, and the greater your access to the limited warmth generated by the central fire. If you were seated at the far end of the hall, you ate cold food in cold air while straining to hear conversations happening at the other end of the room and struggling to see what was happening at the high table through the smoke and shadows that filled the medieval dining environment. Your distance from the center of power was measured in both physical space and food quality, creating a dining hierarchy that reinforced social structures through every meal. Medieval table manners were elaborate affairs designed to demonstrate your breeding and social status, while navigating the practical challenges of eating in conditions that would challenge modern dining etiquette. Medieval etiquette books, which exist in surprising numbers, provide detailed instructions on everything from how to properly share a drinking cup, wipe the rim carefully before passing it to remove any food particles or bodily fluids, to how to behave when you discovered something unpleasant in your food, remove it discreetly and continue eating, without complaint or visible distress. These etiquette rules covered situations that modern diners rarely encounter, such as what to do when insects appeared in your food, ignore them if possible, remove them quietly if necessary, how to handle shared eating utensils, clean them discreetly between uses, and proper protocols for dealing with food that had obviously spoiled. Eat around the bad parts without drawing attention to the problem. The entertainment during meals often involved professional entertainers, but not the refined court musicians you might imagine from modern romantic depictions of medieval life. Medieval entertainment was more likely to involve juggling, crude comedy, acrobatics, and storytelling that would make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable with its casual violence and explicit content. Jesters and minstrels performed for their food and lodging, which meant their material was designed to please whatever audience controlled their next meal, leading to entertainment that was often more desperate than amusing. These entertainers competed for attention with the general chaos of medieval dining, conversations happening at multiple tables, servants moving through the hall carrying food and drink, dogs wandering around looking for scraps, and a general hubbub of dozens or hundreds of people eating in the same space. The acoustic environment made it difficult to hear performances, and entertainers often had to modify their acts to work in conditions that would challenge modern performers. After breakfast, the real work of castle life begins, and this is where the medieval class system reveals its true brutality through daily routines that would make modern labor laws spontaneously combust and then file formal complaints with whatever cosmic authority is responsible for worker safety. If you're nobility, your day involves managing an estate that's essentially a small kingdom, dealing with political intrigue that could literally cost you your head, and trying to maintain your position in a social hierarchy where everyone is constantly plotting against everyone else while pretending to be loyal friends. The administrative work of running a medieval estate involved managing agricultural production, overseeing construction projects, handling legal disputes, maintaining military readiness, and dealing with the constant financial pressures that came from supporting large households, while extracting resources from agricultural communities that were often struggling to survive themselves. Medieval lords were essentially middle managers in a feudal system that was constantly on the verge of collapse, except the consequences of poor performance included execution, exile, or having your land seized by people who claimed to be better qualified for the position. If you're a servant, your day involves approximately 14 hours of manual labor that would make modern occupational safety regulations spontaneously combust, and then rise from the ashes to file formal complaints with whatever cosmic authority handles workplace safety violations. Medieval work was dangerous, exhausting, and relentless, performed with primitive tools in conditions that challenged basic human endurance. Kitchen servants faced constant risks of burns from open fires, cuts from sharp knives, exposure to spoiled food, and the general hazards of working in environments where large quantities of hot food were prepared using techniques that prioritized speed over safety. The kitchen equipment consisted mainly of open fires, large cauldrons, primitive ovens, and sharp implements that doubled as weapons, creating work environments that combined the dangers of metalworking with the risks of food service. Stable hands dealt with large animals that could easily kill or maim them through kicks, bites, or simple accidents involving creatures that weighed several times more than the humans caring for them. Medieval horses were working animals that hadn't been selectively bred for gentle temperaments, and they often responded to stress, pain, or poor treatment with violence that could be fatal to their handlers. Cleaning staff worked with primitive tools and harsh chemicals when chemicals were available at all, to maintain sanitation standards that were essentially better than a plague pit, usually. The cleaning supplies consisted mainly of water when available, crude soaps made from animal fat and ash, and various abrasive materials that were more effective at removing skin than dirt. Winter is coming, and it wants you dead. Welcome back to your personal tour of medieval hell, where the morning's culinary adventures were just the appetizer for a full day of survival challenges that would make modern reality. TV producers weep with envy and immediately start planning new shows. You've survived breakfast, which puts you ahead of a surprising number of medieval people, and now you're facing the rest of your day in this stone monument to human endurance. But first, let's talk about what happens when you're already miserable. Castle life gets upgraded to nightmare difficulty, specifically when winter arrives like an angry medieval god with a personal vendetta against human comfort. Medieval winters weren't just cold. They were apocalyptic events that transformed your already uncomfortable stone prison into a genuine survival challenge where the primary question wasn't, will I be comfortable, but rather, will I still have all my fingers in the spring? According to climate records reconstructed by medieval historians, the period from roughly 1300 to 1700 was what scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a time when European winters were significantly colder than modern ones. Research from the University of Reading. Imagine your current castle discomfort, then add temperatures that would make a modern freezer feel tropical, and you're starting to understand medieval winter survival. The heating system in your castle consists primarily of hope, prayer, and whatever wood you can burn before you run out and have to start making difficult decisions about which pieces of furniture are least essential to daily life. The central hearths in the Great Hall provide small circles of warmth, surrounded by vast Arctic zones where your breath creates clouds and your extremities begin planning their escape from your body through frostbite. Medieval people burned everything that would combust: wood when available, peat, dried animal dung, furniture that had reached the end of its useful life, and occasionally books that were deemed less essential than not freezing to death. The smoke from these fires filled the halls with aromatic clouds that combined with smoke with the distinctive fragrances of whatever else was being burned, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously warming and suffocating. Castle studies and historical records from English heritage. The windows, those narrow slits designed for shooting arrows, rather than keeping out weather, become Arctic wind tunnels that channel freezing air directly into your living spaces, with the efficiency of medieval air conditioning systems designed by people who fundamentally misunderstood the concept of comfort. Medieval people stuffed these openings with whatever materials were available: cloth, animal skins, bundled straw, but these improvised weather barriers were about as effective as trying to stop a hurricane with a paper towel. Your clothing during winter becomes a complex engineering project involving multiple layers of wool, fur, and whatever else you can wrap around yourself before you lose the ability to move your arms. Medieval people wore their entire wardrobes simultaneously, creating human beings who resembled walking fabric storage units, more than recognizable human forms. The weight of winter clothing was so significant that medieval people developed different walking gaits during cold months, and getting dressed required assistance from servants who specialized in the complex logistics of medieval layering. Studies of medieval clothing from archaeological evidence. Sleep during winter becomes a group survival activity. Medieval people shared beds not just for social reasons, but because multiple bodies were the only reliable source of warmth available. Families, servants, guests, and occasionally livestock all crowded into whatever sleeping spaces offered the best chances of survival until spring. Privacy was completely abandoned in favor of not dying from exposure, creating sleeping arrangements that would make modern hostels look spacious and private. The castle's water supply presents special winter challenges that transform basic hydration into daily adventures in medieval problem-solving. Wells freeze, pipes, when they exist, burst, and water storage containers become solid ice that requires extensive effort to convert back into drinking water. Medieval people often had to break ice to access water, then warm that water over fires before it could be consumed, turning every drink into a complex project that required fuel, time, and careful planning. Food storage during winter becomes a desperate race against spoilage, rodents, and your own hunger. The preserved meats we discussed earlier become absolutely essential for survival, but they're also more likely to spoil when heating systems are inadequate and storage areas fluctuate between freezing and thawing. Medieval people often discovered that their carefully preserved food supplies had been contaminated by the same conditions they were trying to survive. Medieval food preservation studies from Thoughtco and various historical sources. But winter misery is just the beginning of seasonal challenges. Let's discuss what happens when your castle becomes a target for people who want to kill everyone inside it, specifically siege warfare, which transforms your stone fortress from an uncomfortable home into a genuine death trap, where the architecture, designed to keep enemies out, also keeps defenders trapped inside with diminishing supplies and increasing desperation. Medieval siege warfare was essentially a contest to see who could outlast the other side's capacity for suffering, and the defenders of a besieged castle were volunteering to be slowly starved, dehydrated, and psychologically tortured while trapped in increasingly unsanitary conditions with people who were becoming more desperate and dangerous every day. Military history sources and siege documentation. The first thing that happens during a siege is that your already inadequate food supplies become precious resources that must be rationed among people who are burning more calories than usual due to stress, defense activities, and the general physical demands of living in a war zone. Medieval siege rations were calculated based on how long the defenders could survive on decreasing amounts of food, creating meal plans that would make modern starvation diets look generous. Water becomes even more critical during sieges, because attacking forces often poisoned wells, contaminated water supplies, or simply prevented access to external water sources. Castle defenders were forced to survive on whatever water was stored inside the walls, supplemented by rainwater collection, and whatever could be extracted from increasingly questionable sources. Medieval people during sieges sometimes resorted to drinking their own urine, water contaminated with waste, or liquids that were more alcohol than water because the brewing supplies lasted longer than clean drinking water. Siege warfare documentation from various castle studies. the waste disposal systems that were barely adequate during normal times become genuine health hazards during sieges. Garderobes continue to be used, but waste disposal becomes increasingly difficult when leaving the castle walls means exposing yourself to enemy fire. Medieval siege defenders often had to choose between emptying waste within the castle, creating sanitation nightmares, or risking death to maintain proper waste disposal practices. The psychological pressure of siege conditions was documented by medieval chroniclers who described defenders becoming increasingly unstable as siege conditions continued. People trapped in castles during extended sieges developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and various stress-related conditions that were exacerbated by malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and the constant threat of violent death. Medieval chronicles and siege accounts. Medieval siege defenders also had to deal with the creative warfare tactics employed by attacking forces, who used biological warfare, psychological intimidation, and engineering solutions designed to make life inside the castle as miserable as possible. Attackers catapulted diseased animal carcasses over castle walls, creating biological hazards that contaminated food supplies and spread disease among defenders. They also used fire arrows, siege engines, and various projectiles designed to damage castle infrastructure and create additional survival challenges for the people trapped inside. The medieval approach to medicine during siege conditions makes normal medieval medical care look sophisticated and effective by comparison. Siege medicine consisted primarily of battlefield surgery performed by people whose medical training consisted of previous experience treating similar injuries, combined with prayer, alcohol, and whatever medicinal supplies had been stored before the siege began. Medieval siege wounds were treated with techniques that were more optimistic than scientific. Arrow wounds were treated by removing the projectile, if possible, and applying whatever substances medieval people believed would prevent infection, typically wine, vinegar, or various herbal preparations that had no actual medical value. Sword wounds were stitched with whatever thread was available, often without cleaning the wound or sterilizing the needle. But let's talk about the medical care available during normal times, because it represents human confidence at its most dangerously misguided. Medieval medicine was based on theories that were so fundamentally wrong that they created treatments which were often more dangerous than the original illnesses. Medical history sources and documentation of medieval medical practices. The theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated medieval medical thinking and led to treatments that were designed to restore supposed balance between these bodily fluids. This theory was so wrong that it's actually impressive how consistently medieval doctors managed to make sick people worse through treatments that were based on complete misunderstandings of human biology. Bloodletting remained the preferred treatment for almost everything throughout the medieval period. According to medical documentation from the British Medical Journal, medieval doctors used bloodletting to treat acne, asthma, cancer, cholera, coma, convulsions, diabetes, epilepsy, gangrene, gout, herpes, indigestion, insanity, jaundice, leprosy, ophthalmia, plague, pneumonia, scurvy, smallpox, stroke, tetanus, tuberculosis, and for some 100 other diseases. The treatment was essentially patient has problem. Patient needs less blood, which was about as medically sound as treating headaches by hitting people with hammers. The tools used for bloodletting were primitive, and often shared between patients, without any understanding of sterilization or infection control. Lancets and fleams, sharp implements with fixed blades, were used to open veins, while medicinal leeches provided what medieval doctors considered a more controlled form of blood removal. These leeches could consume 5 to 10 milliliters of blood each, nearly 10 times their own body weight, making them essentially medieval vampires with medical credentials. Leech therapy documentation from medical history sources. Medieval surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any understanding of infection control that would be recognizable to modern medical professionals. Surgical instruments were often shared between patients without cleaning. Operations were frequently performed in the same rooms where animals were slaughtered for food, and the survival rate for medieval surgery was roughly equivalent to being mauled by a bear, except bears were probably cleaner and more gentle. The medieval understanding of anatomy was based on theories inherited from ancient sources, who had never actually examined human bodies, combined with religious restrictions that prevented systematic study of human anatomy. This led to surgical procedures that were based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about how human bodies actually worked, creating medical practices that were more like elaborate forms of torture than healing. Pain management during medieval medical procedures consisted primarily of alcohol, opium when available, prayer, and the assumption that screaming was perfectly acceptable behavior under the circumstances. Medieval people developed extraordinarily high pain tolerance simply because they had no alternative. Medical procedures were endured with whatever substances were available, and the knowledge that the alternative to treatment was usually death, though the treatment itself was often fatal as well. Dental care deserves special mention because it represents medieval medicine at its most creatively horrifying. Medieval people had no understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay prevention, or proper dental treatment. Dental problems were both common and agonizing, and dental care consisted primarily of tooth extraction performed with crude pliers by people whose primary qualification was owning the necessary tools and being willing to use them on screaming patients. Medieval dental extraction was performed without anesthesia and often resulted in broken jaws, damaged surrounding teeth, and infections that were worse than the original dental problems. Dental pain was treated with various herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, including applications of herbs, animal products, and substances that were more likely to cause additional problems than to provide relief. Now, let's discuss the special miseries reserved for medieval women, because the general awfulness of castle life was significantly enhanced if you happened to be born female in a society that treated women like a combination of property and breeding equipment with occasional decorative functions. Medieval women in castles faced all the same survival challenges as men, plus additional problems related to childbirth, sexual violence, political powerlessness, and social restrictions that would make modern gender inequality look progressive by comparison. Women's roles were defined by their relationships to men. They were daughters, wives, or widows, with very limited opportunities for independent existence or decision-making. Childbirth in medieval castles was a potentially fatal adventure that combined the general inadequacy of medieval medicine with specific misunderstandings about female anatomy and reproduction. Medieval midwifery was practiced by women who had learned their techniques through trial and error, often with fatal results for both mothers and children. The maternal mortality rate was so high that pregnancy was essentially a form of Russian roulette, except with worse odds and more pain. Medieval medical documentation and demographic studies. Medieval childbirth was performed without any understanding of sterile conditions, proper prenatal care, or effective pain management. Women gave birth in conditions that would make modern emergency rooms look luxuriously equipped, assisted by midwives whose medical knowledge consisted of folk remedies, prayer, and whatever techniques had been passed down through generations, of women who were also making things up as they went along. The social restrictions placed on medieval women meant that they had very limited legal rights, couldn't own property independently, and were expected to defer to male authority in all major decisions. Women in castle households were responsible for managing domestic affairs, but they had no real power to make significant changes or improvements to their living conditions. They were expected to endure whatever circumstances they found themselves in while maintaining appropriate feminine behavior and supporting their male relatives. Political and economic activities. Medieval women also faced the constant threat of sexual violence, which was both common and rarely prosecuted. The legal system provided very little protection for women, and sexual assault was often treated as a property crime against the woman's male relatives, rather than as a crime against the woman herself. Women in castle households were particularly vulnerable because they lived in close proximity to large numbers of men who had significant social and economic power over them. The clothing and fashion requirements for medieval women created additional physical challenges that made survival more difficult. Women's clothing was designed to demonstrate social status and conform to religious and social expectations, rather than to provide practical protection from the elements. The elaborate dresses, headdresses, and accessories required for appropriate feminine presentation were expensive to maintain, difficult to clean, and often impractical for the actual activities that medieval women needed to perform. Medieval women were also expected to maintain standards of beauty and feminine presentation that required significant time and resources, while living in conditions that made basic hygiene challenging for everyone. The cosmetics available were often dangerous substances that contained lead, mercury, and other toxic materials that caused health problems that were sometimes worse than being considered unattractive by medieval standards. The servants in medieval castles lived lives that were essentially extended exercises in survival horror, where every day presented new challenges to basic human dignity and physical safety. Castle servants worked approximately 14 hours per day during summer months and somewhat shorter hours during winter, when daylight was limited and some outdoor work became impossible. Documentation from English heritage about servant conditions. The work schedule for castle servants was dictated by the needs of the household rather than by considerations of human endurance or worker welfare. Servants were expected to be available whenever their services were needed, which often meant interrupted sleep, irregular meals, and constant physical demands that challenged basic human limits. The sleeping arrangements for servants ranged from barely adequate to genuinely dangerous depending on their position in the servant hierarchy. Higher-ranking servants, like stewards and chamberlains, might have their own small chambers, while general labourers slept wherever they could find space, in kitchens after the fires died down, in corridors during brief periods when foot traffic decreased, in storage rooms among the supplies they were responsible for maintaining. The food provided to servants was typically leftovers from the noble family's meals, supplemented by bread, ale, and whatever else was available in the castles. Food supplies. Servant meals were often cold by the time they were able to eat, and the quality was significantly lower than what was served to the noble family and their guests. Servants were expected to be grateful for whatever food they received, regardless of its quality or safety. The working conditions for servants included constant exposure to dangerous equipment, toxic substances, extreme temperatures, and physical hazards that would make modern occupational safety regulations spontaneously combust. Kitchen servants worked with open fires, sharp knives, and heavy equipment that could easily cause serious injuries. Cleaning staff used harsh chemicals and worked in conditions that exposed them to dangerous fumes and toxic substances. The castle's rodent population deserves extended discussion because it represents another level of medieval misery that affected everyone living in the castle, regardless of their social status. Medieval castles were essentially luxury resorts for rats, mice, and various other creatures that found the combination of food supplies, warm hiding places, and minimal pest control to be ideal living conditions. The thick stone walls of castles provided perfect nesting sites for rodent families, while the abundance of stored grain, food waste, and general medieval filth created a buffet that supported thriving rodent communities that were often larger and better organized than the human households they shared space with. Archaeological evidence from medieval castles shows that rodent populations often outnumbered human inhabitants by significant margins. Medieval people accepted rodent infestations as normal parts of life and developed various strategies for coexisting with their uninvited roommates. Food storage techniques included hanging supplies from ceilings, storing items in sealed containers, and accepting that a certain percentage of food supplies would be consumed by creatures other than humans. The economic impact of rodent consumption was significant enough that medieval households often budgeted for losses to vermin as a regular expense. The health implications of rodent infestations were severe, though medieval people didn't understand the connection between rats and disease transmission. Rodents carried fleas that transmitted bubonic plague, contaminated food supplies with their waste, and generally created sanitation problems that contributed to the high disease rates that characterized medieval life. As evening approaches and you prepare to return to your flea-infested bed for another night of restless sleep, interrupted by cold, strange noises, and the various creatures that share your living space, you begin to understand that medieval castle life was essentially an extended exercise in human endurance that tested the limits of what people could survive while maintaining some semblance of civilization. The daily routine of medieval castle life was designed around survival rather than comfort, and even the wealthiest nobles lived in conditions that would challenge modern camping enthusiasts. The combination of inadequate heating, primitive sanitation, dangerous food preservation, questionable medical care, and constant social tensions created living conditions that were more like survival challenges than normal domestic life. Evening meal follows the same patterns as breakfast and dinner, except that by the end of the day, everyone is tired, hungry, and even more irritable than usual. The food is the same combination of preserved meat, stale bread, and questionable ale, served in conditions that haven't improved since morning. The entertainment might include storytelling, music, or various games, but the primary evening activity is usually preparing for another night of uncomfortable sleep in conditions that would make modern prisons look luxurious. As you finally return to your bed, that thin straw mattress that served as home base for your day-long adventure in medieval survival, you realize that tomorrow will bring exactly the same challenges, discomforts, and survival tests that you've just endured. Medieval castle life was essentially Groundhog Day, except instead of Bill Murray learning to appreciate life, you're stuck in an endless loop of cold, hunger, discomfort, and the constant threat of death from diseases that modern medicine could cure with a quick trip to the pharmacy. But here's the thing that makes this whole medieval nightmare even more depressing. This was considered the good life. Castle inhabitants were the privileged class, the wealthy elite who had access to the best food, housing, and medical care available in medieval society. The peasants living in villages outside the castle walls lived in conditions that made castle life look like luxury accommodations. So, as you drift off to sleep on your straw mattress, surrounded by the sounds of medieval nightlife, rats scurrying through the walls, people coughing from smoke inhalation, the occasional scream from someone whose dreams have been interrupted by flea bites or food poisoning, remember that you're experiencing medieval life at its absolute finest. And when you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll do it all again, because this is your life now, and the only escape is death, which might actually be a relief after a few weeks of authentic medieval living. But fortunately for you, dear viewer, this is just a video, and when it ends, you get to return to your modern life with central heating, indoor plumbing, refrigeration, modern medicine, and all the other conveniences that make 21st century existence infinitely superior to medieval castle life. So go brush your teeth with actual toothpaste, drink some clean water from a tap, and appreciate the fact that you live in an era when survival isn't a daily challenge and comfort is considered a basic human right rather than an impossible dream. Welcome back to the modern world, where even the worst day is infinitely better than the best day in a medieval castle.